Hello everyone, welcome back to My Hero Academia Podfics. Today will be the continuation of Deku and Death. This will be part 10, chapter 10, entitled Actions Prove Why Words Mean Nothing. It didn't take long for spring to arrive, as well as the start of UA, but it sure felt like a while to Midoriya. It had only been a couple of months after the entrance exam, but so much had gone down. There was never a dull moment, but every moment felt dull. It was hard for the boy to explain, but Gami seemed to understand it just fine. Ishahara's death had hit him hard. He sometimes found himself walking to the blue house in hopes that he could be let inside, only to meet the police tape that surrounded the property. He heard the family had already had the funeral, and as much as he knew it, he wouldn't get an invitation to it. It still left him feeling awfully depressed. All he had were the few plates that the man had given him for taking cookies home. Those ceramic plates stayed on the bottom shelf of the bookcase with his flowers. He would never risk them falling and breaking at all. But currently the teen wasn't in the comfort of his room with his flowers and his plates. No, right now he was in the principal's office at Aldera. His day at school had been as it usually was, except for the teacher telling him that the principal wanted to see him and Bakugo after class. He wasn't sure what the man wanted with him at first, but now he had made it obvious. "How wonderful that two of our students have made it into UA. The plump man started talking. The comment would have been nice if it weren't for the subtle message that he knew the man was pushing. Midoriya opted to stand still towards the back of the office. His gloved hands picked at his uniform pants. He desperately wanted to leave this situation, and he knew that Gami felt the same. Said man stood next to his successor, up against the wall. There wasn't much space in the office, so the ghost could feel that portion of his form was more like in this wall. He also wasn't comfortable in the situation and was ready to head out. "Especially you, Midoriya," he continued, despite the growing tension in the small office. "That's a miracle we never expected." The principal's words made him want to puke. He wasn't the quirkless miracle they thought he was. He was strong, he was capable, and now he had the confidence to know that he was all that even without his powers. Bakugo was also in the office, but stood closer to the principal. His hands were stuffed in his pockets, and his shoulders slumped back. Though the blonde hadn't pulled anything too brash since the sludge villain incident, he still wasn't eager to be this close in proximity. Eventually, the principal finally stopped talking, and the boy took the opportunity to leave the room. He rushed out of the school, not wanting to be caught with Bakugo after hours. He passed by the courtyard, and the beautiful tree in the center seemed to wave goodbye. Of course, he knew it was only the wind, but it was nice to pretend sometimes. He entered his alleyway shortcut like he did every day. It was a long path to take, and it sometimes seemed to be dark, no matter the time of day. The alleyway still gave the teen a bit of chill, but he was constantly on alert. That was a skill that he had gratefully picked up after the sludge villain incident, and it hadn't disappointed him yet. So Midoriya knew that Bakugo had followed him into the alley. The teen's loud and harsh footsteps betrayed him enough, even without his keen sense of observation. That didn't mean he was expecting the blonde to shove him up against the building wall. "What dirty tricks did you use to do it, you quirkless shit?" Bakugo growled and grabbed him by the front of his shirt. He pulled the boy up close to his face and yelled again, spit flying everywhere. "Huh?" Midoriya flinched on reflex, shutting his eyes and raising his gloved hands to protect his face. He was more composed around his other peers, but something about the angry blonde just didn't sit right with him. Maybe it was because they were friends at one point. He didn't really know. "I was supposed to be the first and only from this shitty school," he continued, furiously, and thrusted the teen against the wall once more. "You've ruined everything." The timid boy looked to Gami, who was desperately trying to pull Bakugo off of him. When the spirit finally understood that his arms would not solidify, and would only continue to pass through the student, he moved to yank on his successor instead, but the minute the specter lifted his head up slightly and made eye contact with the trapped teen, he hesitated. Something in his friend's eyes screamed at him not to intervene, so he backed off wearily but kept his guard up. But Bakugo didn't catch the little interaction. His tunnel vision was only focused on rage. "I thought I told you not to try for UA. I told you—" Midoriya didn't mean to react, honestly, but his body moved before he could think. He grabbed Bakugo's arm, the one that was holding him against the alley wall, tightly. He burrowed his gloved fingers deep into the uniform's fabric, half hoping to bruise the skin. The teen still kept his head down during all this. His unruly hair dangled over his eyes and blocked the blonde's startled reaction from his sight. Well, I've got full faith that you'll turn out to be someone great, and if you're planning on going into heroics, then I'll just have to keep an ear out for you. Somebody told me, he started shakily, his heart heavy. I meant what I said when I first met you, Midoriya. Quirk or not, you're going to be a great hero one day. That I could be a hero. He slammed his feet into the ground, steadying himself. The boy corrected himself. Bakugo. Said teen barely registered the words being said to him. He didn't understand why useless, worthless Deku kept going. All their other classmates had already given up on competing with him, and they had quirks, so why didn't Deku just give up too? Midoriya wasn't sure where this courage was coming from. He had stood up for himself in front of Bakugo before, but usually it was in a more passive way. Never something as brash as yelling back, though. But he didn't question it, and he just let his mouth run. I earned this. Gami certainly wasn't expecting an outburst from his successor, but that didn't mean he wasn't proud. He knew the boy hated confrontation, as well as the attention it followed, but that had just made the few times he snapped all the more prideful to watch. The man knew that he couldn't force the boy to be more assertive towards Bakugo or the others, but he was glad that he was growing to be more confident at the very least. That's why The teen locked his grip on the blonde's arm and pulled it off of him impulsively. He couldn't stand how aggressive or touchy Bakugo was, always seeming to creep into his personal space to ridicule him or make him feel miserable. After way too many times of him using his quirk on his shoulder where his father's scar was laid, he had grown to dislike any time Bakugo laid his hands on him at all, whether it was on said scar or not. But right now he wasn't focused on the blonde's lack of personal awareness. Sure, he had removed the invasive grip on his shoulder, but that didn't mean he was done yet. He wasn't the useless, workless Deku that Bakugo thought he was. He was a changed person. The sludge villain incident changed him. Meeting All Might changed him. The entrance exam changed him. Ishahara's death changed him. Gami's consistent support changed him, and Bakugo needed to realize that. He began to distance himself from the blonde, walking down the alleyway towards the other end. Bakugo, while still in shock, began to go after the teen, but Midoriya quickly turned to face him, his glare stopping the angry boy in his tracks. I'm going to be a hero no matter what, so get used to it. He didn't need to yell it out or check on Bakugo as he walked out of the alley. He knew the blonde heard him loud and clear. Gami rushed to catch up to the teen. He got to see Bakugo's reaction clearly, and it put a smile on his hidden face. The spirit wasn't expecting such a fierce declaration from his successor, but neither was Bakugo, based on his seething expression. He caught up to the boy right as he turned onto another street, but said boy didn't seem to notice. That was not like you. Midoriya jumped at the sound of his mentor's calm voice. He tightened his grip on his backpack straps. Yeah, sorry about that. I did not mean it like that. Not in a bad way, anyway. The normally reserved teen looked up at that. Never mind. It was nice to see you stand up for yourself, though. And then the teen looked back down bashfully, but regained his composure. I heard enough already from the principal. I didn't want to hear more from Bakugo, of all people. I guess that is understandable. The two continued to walk together, but Gami was merely following his successor. He assumed that they were headed home at first, but the boy didn't turn down the street like he was supposed to. The man didn't question it, though, and just kept following without a word. As for Midoriya, he really didn't know where he was going. He simply wanted to walk wherever his feet were taking him. He was a bit shaken after the confrontation with Bakugo in the alley, but it felt good to finally tell off the blonde. It was something that didn't happen often, but when it did, it felt like striking gold. But his mind was now wandering aimlessly, just like he was. It wasn't really something that mattered where he was going, as long as it was away from that alley. He noticed that he had stopped, so he shook himself out of his thoughts and looked up to figure out where exactly he was. He froze when a partially destroyed, quaint blue house met his gaze. The boy had found himself walking to the house as a force of habit, but as much as he tried not to, he ended up here multiple times a week. Each time he did, the house's perimeter was blocked off by police tape and would only permit him so close. But that wasn't an object of complaint for him. He was quite fine looking out at the friendly house from a distance. Ending up at Ishahara's home wasn't what made him freeze. What made him freeze was the fact that police tape no longer fenced him out. He took a slow step forward into the area, where before the tape hadn't let him cross. He stopped and listened, but there wasn't any sound. No policeman telling him to leave, no bystanders asking him what he was doing, but also no Ishahara calling him back inside. It was bittersweet, but he was going to take advantage of the fact that no one was going to tell him no. Midoriya made his way up to the front of the stairs, savoring each step on the weathered but homey concrete. His hand moved to brush against the metal rails, and though he couldn't feel the smooth steel, the chill still seeped through his glove anyway. It had been such a while since he had gotten to walk up these steps, and it almost made him burst into tears. But he wasn't going to cry out in public, so he forced the tears back in and continued. When he finally reached the front door, the teen wasn't sure what to do. He wanted to knock, but he was positive no one would answer. He did remember Ishahara going on and on about his family, but as far as he knew, the old man lived alone. And if someone did answer, what would he say? There wasn't a real reason he was here, other than the pull of something unnatural. No person in their right mind would let a stranger in for no reason, even if that stranger claimed to know the owner of the house. Izu, what exactly are you doing? I don't really know. But even then, the boy made no effort to remove himself from the property. His instincts were telling him to wait, even if those instincts didn't really know what they were waiting for. But his gut hadn't failed him yet, so he gave the feeling a chance and continued to wait in front of the door. I really think that we should get go. That's when the door opened. At the door was a woman. She looked older, but definitely not as old as Ishahara, and had long brown hair that nearly reached her mid-chest. She jumped, not expecting him there, but quickly composed herself. She took up an annoyed stance, almost like it hurt her eyes to look at him. "Excuse me," she said snarkily, "but what exactly are you doing here?" Midoriya hesitated, not expecting someone to open the door either. He began to introduce himself, even though she hadn't asked his name. I know who you are," she interrupted hastily. "You quirkless brat, you're wasting my time, so scram." The teen flinched at the declaration. She must live somewhere in the neighborhood then, if she knew he didn't have a quirk, but he still tried to get a word in. "Please, Ishihara-san, who's at the door?" Both parties stopped at that call, though for completely different reasons, but the woman recovered faster and called back. "It's nothing, Takagi, just some quirkless kid," she replied, and then turned to look at the boy, who's about to be leaving. Midoriya shuddered, but didn't move as the unknown voice from before made his way to the front door. "Nonsense, Ishihara-san, I'm coming to see for myself." The voice called out again, and the footsteps grew louder. The brown-haired woman seemed to grow a shade paler. No, it's fine, really, there's no need." The puzzled teen shared a glance at the specter next to him, who seemed equally lost. The man just shrugged at his successor, at a loss for what to do. Getting no real helpful advice from the ghost, he decided to just wait and see who came to the door. And right at that moment, a black-haired man in fine clothing met his curious gaze. The man's dark brown eyes met his own, and he looked away with embarrassment. He hoped this man was more open to what he had to say, if he could get his timid voice to say anything at all. "Hello," the man began first, to which Midoriya was grateful. "Who might you be?" I'm Midoriya Izuku. I was hoping—" "Wait," he interrupted. Goodness, was anyone going to let him talk today? "Did you say your name was Midoriya Izuku?" That made the boy do a double take. Yes, and— "Oh, that's wonderful." The death duo stared at each other in a quick look of bewilderment before the teen returned his attention to the man in a sharp suit. He was a bit weary of why this man was interested in him, but the cheerful smile in front of him pushed back any of his worries enough to hear him out. The man must have picked up on his hesitation, though, because he started to backtrack. Sorry. Let me introduce myself. I'm Takagi Masa, and I'm the Ishihara's family executor." Then he gestured to the brown-haired woman that had answered the door originally. "This is Ishihara Tado's daughter, Ishahara Kanoe." The newly introduced Kanoe coughed. "Takagi, what are you doing? We have work to do." Takagi simply flashed her a bright smile before continuing on with his tangent. "I'm sure you already know, but as the Ishihara's family executor, I'm in charge of making sure that Ishihara's will is properly taken care of." Midoriya, in fact, did not know this. Between training for UA and keeping out of trouble at Aldera, He hadn't had the chance to brush up on legal studies, but he merely nodded his head and let the man keep talking. Ishahara Tato did name one Midori Izuku in his will, but hadn't left any way to contact him. I was wondering how I was going to get in touch with you, but the universe works in mysterious ways, it seems. That statement definitely caught the teen's interest. Ishahara has left him something in his will. That certainly surprised him, though he hadn't had the faintest idea of what it could be. Well, why don't you come inside, Midoriya-kun, since we'll need to talk things out? The boy barely croaked out a response. Sure, I guess. Takagi then ushered him inside, but Konoe, she had finally managed to compose herself enough to come back in as well. Gami was left alone, wondering if he should really intrude on a matter this sensitive, but he decided to join his successor just in case. He quickly phased through the door to catch up. By the time he did, Midoriya was now sitting at the home's small dining room table with Takagi. He could tell the teen was nearly in tears, and not only because he was finally back in the house, the spirit had called Ishahara patching up the boy a few years back at that table, where he had later come out as quirkless. That day was momentous to his successor, as he finally had the support of someone other than the ghost. But Gami stopped reminiscing when the raven-haired man piped up again. Normally we wouldn't do things here, he started, but you just so happened to catch Ishihara-san and I finalizing the details of her portion of the will. The teen nodded in understanding, waiting for the man to continue. Luckily, your visit still works out pretty well, since I've already set aside the items bestowed to you. Takagi reached over to a stack of paper in the dining room table and shuffled through them. He pulled out a few sheets from the center and laid them out in front of the boy. He picked them up to examine them, but the man started talking again. Because you're under 18, as the executor, I'm supposed to hold on to your inheritance until you come of age. But the items that you've inherited hold little monetary value from a legal standpoint, so I can offer them to you now. Midoriya picked out his name in the set of papers that Takagi had handed him. He was written into Ishihara's will, but he couldn't find what his inheritance was on the mass of words. He looked up to the executor, finally realizing he had stopped talking. Do I need a lawyer for this? The man chuckled. Typically, I'd recommend one when dealing with inheritance, but like I said before, what you've inherited is so little of monetary value that it's really not necessary, though the decision is entirely up to you. The teen eyed his mentor briefly, hoping that it was enough to catch the spirit's attention. Thankfully it was. I only remember dealing with a few inheritance proceedings in my time, but from what I do know, I think you're all right. He gave a curt nod in acknowledgement before moving to respond. I guess I'm good then. Oh, wonderful. You saved me quite a bit of time, Midoriya-kun. I love how clean this is turning out to be. Midoriya, Gami, and Konoe had watched in silence as Takagi had sang praises to himself. For dealing with a deceased's will, the man's was oddly bubbly, but the boy guessed it came with the job. Takagi seemed to realize that he was making a scene and calmed himself down enough to continue. Well, Midoriya-kun, follow me. He stood up from his chair, prompting the team to get up as well. I've laid out your inheritance in the living room. The suited man walked out of the dining room so abruptly, and he dashed after him. Gami didn't trail behind as far as interested as to see how the situation was going to play out. The boy had to stop himself, nearly crashing into Takagi. The executor seemed to be a bit hasty in his actions, and that was starting to get on his nerves, but the man has been nothing but nice to him, so he refused the urge to call him out. He stayed close behind the man as he slowly walked into the room, but still couldn't see much. Here it all is, he stated, and moved out of the way, allowing Midoriya a perfect view of the coffee table. On said table was a cardboard box, carefully folded together and taped. Only the top flaps were left open, so he cautiously made his way over to peer inside. Gami, too, was curious, but opted to let his successor take the first peek. Midoriya wasn't going to lie, he was nervous. He really wasn't sure what to expect in the box, but he knew it wasn't going to be anything bad. He wished he could tell that to his brain, though. His hands were shaky and sweaty, and the boy was afraid he wouldn't be able to open the box like this. Still, he willed up any confidence he had left and slowly lifted open the flaps. The first thing that caught his eye was the glint of sunlight. It nearly blinded him, so he had to step back. But upon further examination, there wasn't a miniature sun in the box. Instead, there was something silver that reflected the sunlight coming from the window. He carefully lifted the silver object out to get a better look, and almost dropped it in shock. It was a beautiful silver kettle with an antique finish. He quickly switched to hold it by the thin handle as to not smudge the polished surface. It looked pristine, so he assumed it was unused and kept away in an attic or something. But when he turned it over to check, he could see the scorch marks from where it was used time after time over a stove. That nearly brought him to tears, but not for the reason you'd expect. The searing on the bottom of the kettle merely confirmed to the boy that this was most likely the kettle that Ishahara used to prepare tea for the two of them. Clearing his consciousness, he gently set the kettle down on the coffee table and moved to look in the cupboard box again. Inside, the next thing that his eyes picked out was a notebook with a light brown cover on it, so he wrapped his fingers around the slightly worn spine to pull it out. At first glance, he wasn't sure exactly what the book contained, as it had no words on the cover, so he tenderly flipped it through the pages, but he couldn't tell what the book was about even then, so he stopped on a random page to examine the scrawls. After reading the first few lines, he figured out it was a recipe. Going back to look at the other pages, the teen realized that the book was full of baking recipes, cookies and pastries that Ishahara loved to bake and serve when he came over. That actually brought him to tears, so he placed the book down next to the kettle before those droplets fell. Takagi watched the boy grow more and more emotional at unboxing the items that were left for him. The executor smiled warmly at the sight. He knew firsthand how emotionally valuable inheritance could be, despite whatever its monetary value was. Honestly, he was glad it wasn't worth much, or else he would have had to hold it on to himself by the time the teen managed to reach of age. Kanoe was practically indifferent to the situation, but not without curiosity. She wondered what relations this kid had possessed with her father, but now she had lost most of her hostility towards him, but that didn't mean she was eager to be around him. Midoriya figured he wasted enough of their time by crying, so he wiped his tears and his eyes and reached into the cardboard box again. There was one last thing inside, so he grabbed it with both hands and lifted it out. The item was a wooden box, a bit heavier than he expected, and he put the box down onto the coffee table and ran a gloved hand over the smooth wood. It had a golden clasp on the front, so he popped it open and raised the lid. When the sight of the chess set that he and Ishahara played with met his gaze, the waterworks were set into overdrive. He collapsed onto his knees, held open the box tightly to his chest, and sobbed, startling the other two, as well as the ghost that was still in the room. Gami quickly moved into action, floating over to assist in any way that he could, but it was Kanoe who actually said the first coherent sentence. "What is it?" She craned her neck to get a better view. "A chess set." "Indeed, Ishihara-san," Takagi replied. "That, along with the kettle and recipe book, were specifically left for Midoriya-kun in the will." Said boy seemed to compose himself enough to close the box and get back up to his feet. He sniffled out a quiet little "sorry" before placing the chess set back into the cardboard box. "Nonsense," the suited man replied. "These situations are always emotional." The teen had rubbed the stray tears from his eyes and wiped his wet hands on his school uniform. He made sure his hands were dry enough before grabbing the recipe book and the kettle to put them back into the box as well. The brunette woman broke the silence again, her noisiness getting the better of her. "What exactly was your relationship with my father?" Midoriya was startled at the seemingly sincere question directed at him, especially from a person so hostile towards him at first, but he took the time to think about it. There were so many ways he could describe their relationship, and yet not enough words. He didn't take too long, though, just to ensure the woman's patience didn't run out. He finished packing away the 3 items and shut the cardboard box, placed a hand on the top to force the 2 flaps down. "Ishihara-san was a really close friend." She looked shocked. "That's it?" The boy laughed and picked up the cardboard box carefully, making sure not to disturb any of the items inside. "Well, I'd like to believe he thought the same of me, but I'm sure he had many friends other than myself." The younger Ishahara scoffed. "Well, obviously." Midoriya continued despite the quip. "And while I'm sure I was not Ishihara-san's first friend, he was most certainly mine." Takagi's smile fell just a bit, but he picked it back up before anyone could notice. The brown-haired woman didn't make any outward expressions, but she swore that she felt a sharp tug on her heartstrings at that. Gami wasn't hurt at that declaration. It was technically the truth. The older man was his successor's first human friend. Besides, the Spectre was already aware that he would forever be the OG. The teen paused at that, and took a moment to reminisce. Ishahara was a lot of firsts for him. The first person he had a premonition about, the first person that he saved, the first person who had invited him over, and the first person to bake treats for him as well. He was the first person who had ever patched him up, and the first one who supported his dreams. The boy held the cardboard box close to his chest, squeezing it tightly in his arms. I'm really thankful to have known him. The first day of UA arrived faster than Midoriya thought it would, but he was ready. He set his phone alarm for early that morning, even earlier than he normally got up for his deathly duties. He wanted to give himself plenty of time to pack and prepare. The last thing he wanted to do was arrive late on the first day. Kami had helped him pack the night before, though, so he didn't feel all that stressed waking up this morning. He straightened out his UA uniform. The gray, a nice change from the black of Aldera. The spirit had attempted to teach the boy how to do his tie, but his efforts were fruitless. He still walked out of the house that morning with a poorly done fat tie, as well as his signature red sneakers and his black leather bag. The subway ride didn't feel as long as it was, and evidently enough, the duo had walked down the beautiful path that they had taken before the entrance exams. Just as the teen had hoped, the trees now grew luscious green leaves on their branches and framed the walkway luxuriously. He almost wished that he could spend the whole day out here, but knew that that wasn't an option. He calmly strolled down the halls of the prestigious school, looking for his class. He had studied the map that came with the acceptance letter, but still managed to forget where he was going in awe of observing every nook and cranny. Thankfully, the ghost had looked at the map as well and was now leading the boy down the right hall. The two finally arrived at the large door that read 1A on it in big, bold lettering. They both stopped to stare mesmerizingly at it. Well, that is certainly one massive entryway. Midoriya chuckled. It has to be accessible to everyone, no matter what their quirks. But after that, he felt his laughter die off to replace his nervousness. Once he entered the classroom, he'd be in a room full of the best. That thought made his heart sputter. Did he deserve to be here? Even though he technically didn't have a quirk, he did have powers. Did he make his acceptance count, or was it a petty excuse? What if he was taking the spot from someone else who really deserved it? His head started to spiral again, but Kami caught it before he could fall any deeper. Just remember that you earned your spot here, he spoke softly. You took the same exam everyone else did, and you came out at the very top. The boy smiled at his mentor. Yeah, you're right. He moved his gloved hands to grip at the sliding door and pulled it open slowly. His mind drifted back to Bakugo at that moment, as well as the other kid that embarrassed him from the entrance exam, but he shook it off as best he could. Let's just hope that they're in the other class, he remarked to no one. Who? And that's when the door opened up all the way to reveal the blue-haired boy yelling strictly at Bakugo right near the front of the room. Never mind, I think I know who. Remove your foot from that desk, the strict boy from the exam had berated. Such an action is insulting to those who came to UA, before us as well as the craftsman who made the desk. Like I care, the blonde scoffed, not moving his foot. What middle school are you from, extra? Midoriya deadpanned. It was just his luck that both kids happened to be in his class. He wasn't sure how he'd deal with Bakugo, but he hoped at the very least that he could get on good terms with the other boy. Said boy gaped at Bakugo's expression and his response, but answered the question regardless. I'm from Some Private Academy. My name is Ida Tenya. Some, he repeated with a smug grin. A stuck-up elitist, then. I should blow you to bits. Ida grew even more flabbergasted at that. Blow me to bits? Do you really wish to become a hero? It was then that Ida noticed the green-haired boy standing nervously in the doorway. He shuffled over to him to introduce himself again. Oh, dear. I'm from Some Private Academy, the teen started again. Ah, I heard you from before, he interrupted, not really wanting to hear the same spiel again. I'm Midoriya Izuku. Pleased to meet you, Ida. Midoriya, Ida mumbled out, causing said teen to flinch. That name reminded him too much of home. Maybe he could get his classmates to call him by a nickname or something. You perceived the true nature of that practical exam, while I did not. The reserved boy and his mentor shared a look. He hadn't really perceived anything during the exam. He simply did what was right. He couldn't just stand and watch as the nice brunette got hurt, or as the giant robot tore up the mock city. He wasn't expecting to get any points, much less 60 rescue ones, but he wasn't complaining. I misjudged you. Goodness, was that boy still talking? I hate to admit it, but you were the superior candidate. Well, I only did what I thought was right, he whispered, not enjoying the attention he was getting. I'm going to go sit down now. He started to walk away from the blue male, and this was definitely not how he wanted to start his first day. But if he walked away from the spotlight now, there was still a chance he could get away with a quiet rest of his day, though it didn't seem like the universe wanted that for him, because just as he attempted to move away from Ida, the class door opened again. "That curly hair! It's you!" Midori recognized the voice, but he still jolted from surprise. He turned around, and sure enough, it was the nice girl from the entrance exam. He smiled softly and tried to make his way to his seat. The brunette didn't seem to realize his discomfort, though, and walked right up to him. "You got in, just like President Mike said." She cheered enthusiastically, pumping her fist into the air. "It makes sense, though. That swing was awesome." The timid teen grew more nervous at her loud and bubbly personality, but at feeling the ghost run a cold, bony hand through his hair, he calmed down enough to respond. Well, I have to thank you for speaking on my behalf." Gami just listened as the talkative girl rambled on and on to his successor. He took the time to examine the other kids in the classroom. There were certainly a variety of quirks, to say the least, and each student looked unique, but his gaze inevitably landed on the seething blonde. The spirit could tell Bakugo wasn't happy about the arrival of his friend, but he hadn't made any attempts to quip at him yet, much less attack him. That was definitely an improvement from Aldera, so the specter wasn't too upset. "So we've got our entrance ceremony and guidance sessions today, right?" Gami wondered if all these kids just liked to talk or if his successor was just a quieter one than normal. But nonetheless, she hadn't waited for a response before continuing. "I wonder what our teacher will be like. Boy, am I nervous." Midoriya chuckled nervously. He felt the same way, but he was eager to go sit down. They were still at the front of the classroom, and he could feel all the eyes on the two of them. He wondered where his teacher was, considering he still wasn't in the classroom yet. "If you're here to socialize, then get out." "Ah, speak of the devil, and he shall appear." He watched the brunette turn around towards the open door in shock, and he turned to look as well, all while he didn't know what to expect. Considering his homeroom teacher, he certainly wasn't prepared to see a haggard-looking man wrapped up in a yellow sleeping bag. He pulled his hand out of the bag, along with what looked to be a juice pouch. He gave the pouch a nice long suck before he moved to stand up. He unzipped the sleeping bag and let it fall to his feet, revealing his outfit, which consisted of a black jumpsuit and a familiar gray scarf. "Oh my God, that's Pro-Hero Eraserhead!" The teen's analytic mind snapped into overdrive. "This is certainly interesting." "It took 8 seconds for you to quiet down," the rugged man stated bluntly. "Time is a precious resource. You lot aren't very rational, are you?" The class didn't really know how to react to the man or his declaration. Many simply gaped at him like a fish. The man didn't waste any time, though, and continued talking. "I'm your homeroom teacher, Aizawa Shota. Pleased to meet you." Once the man introduced himself, Midori was sure that he was Eraserhead. If the scarf didn't give him away, the name surely did. He was arguably the boy's favorite underground hero ever, and he had a few pages in his notebook dedicated to him, his quirk, and his fighting style, of course. It was unlikely that his other classmates had ever heard of him, since he really tried to stay out of the media spotlight, but he wasn't about to call the man out, since the teacher obviously didn't introduce himself as Eraserhead for some reason. "Change into your gym clothes and out to the grounds," he said, not skipping a beat. "Your clothes should be in the locker assigned to you at the class locker rooms." The teen didn't want to be the first person to leave the room, so he hesitated and let Ida, along with some of the other students, leave first, before following them to the locker room. "That was Eraserhead, correct?" Gami inquired. He nodded subtly, trying not to draw attention to himself. He walked into the locker room and looked for his own. All of the lockers had numbers plated onto them, but also had sticky notes as well. He assumed that the sticky notes had their names on them, so he searched for his. Finally finding it, he opened the door to see his gym clothes, which were a dark blue with white lines that spelled out the school's initials. Quickly unfolding them, he realized the tops were short-sleeved. Luckily, he had come prepared just in case. Placing his backpack into the locker, he opened it and pulled out a black long-sleeved turtleneck. He had purchased a few more of these shirts, thin and moisture-wicking for any sort of summer activities. He had placed one of them in his bag in the event that he needed it for school, not really expecting to be out on the grounds on the first day, though. Midori closed his locker and moved towards the bathroom stalls. All the other boys were changing out in the open, but he wasn't too keen on revealing his scars. He knew the burn one would attract a lot of attention, at the very least, and that was definitely something he didn't want. He knew some kids were giving him weird looks, but he tried not to pay any attention. He opened one of the stall doors and walked in with his gym clothes and turtleneck. "It was a good thing you decided to bring that with you." The teen hummed out a noise of approval, taking off his uniform top to slip on the turtleneck. The neck was tall enough to cover a bit of the burn scar that peeked out of his uniform, and the sleeves reached all the way to his wrist to shield the other injuries from view. And that was just the way he liked it. "Do not let them get to you. They are just being curious." "I know," he whispered under his breath. He figured there would be stares if he decided not to change out in the open, so he wasn't too surprised when he was proven correct. That was simply the nature of curiosity. When someone acts out of the ordinary, it draws attention. He was used to it. Though one stare remained on him a bit longer than the others, and returned once he left the stall as well. The boy didn't notice it, but Gami certainly did. At first the old ghost assumed it was Bakugo, but a certain head of candy cane hair had made him reassess his initial assumptions. A quirk test! Midoriya had hung around the back of the class once he got outside. He wore the gym clothes just like everyone else, just with his black turtleneck underneath. It covered the parts of his neck and arms that his gym uniform did not, paired with his usual black polyester gloves, and he was comfortable and ready to go. He and Gami tuned in to the conversation currently playing out. "What about the entrance ceremony or the guidance sessions?" He heard the nice brunette from before the exam actually ask the question. He really needed to learn her name. "You don't have time to waste on that stuff if you want to become heroes," Aizawa began. At that, hushed murmurs grew from the class, so the teacher proceeded speaking. "UA is known for its freestyle education system," he continued, and the whispers died down. "That applies to us teachers as well." Aizawa walked over to what the team presumed to be an area for softball throwing and beckoned the class to follow. The new first year shuffled over nervously, including Midoriya. Just because he knew that man was Eraserhead didn't make him any less intimidating. Actually, the pro was probably more intimidating with the knowledge that he was such a scarily effective underground hero, despite his non-offensive quirk. Softball throwing, standing long jump, 50-meter dash, endurance running. The boy was confused at first why the hero was listing basic exercises, but then he realized that those were the kind of tests that he'd done in gym class back at Aldera. Of course, he didn't say anything, and the teacher continued. Grip strength, side-to-side stepping, upper body training, seated toe touch. He turned towards his mentor, who seemed a bit puzzled. I guess it was fair to assume the man didn't perform anything like standardized athletic tests during his adolescence. He doubted there was even standardized athletics testing 5 centuries ago. "You did all these in middle school, yes?" Aizawa addressed the confused looks in the crowd. "Your standard, no quirks allowed gym tests." The homeroom teacher scoffed, seemingly at his own statement. "This country still insists on prohibiting quirks when calculating the averages of those records. It's not rational. The Department of Education is simply procrastinating." Midoriya couldn't deny what the pro was saying. The education system was sorely behind when it came to implementing transitions for quirks in the classroom. He remembered Aldera's rules when it came to quirks, not only the ones pertaining to use in general. His middle school allowed a lot of unfair treatment depending on the quirk a student would have. Bakugo and himself were prime examples. He had hoped for some changes while he was still in middle school, whether by Aldera or by the department themselves, but he knew not to expect anything. As they say, hope for the best and expect the worst. "Midoriya," Aizawa called out, startling the boy out of his thoughts. "Where are you?" Right here, sir," he responded passively, moving to the front of the crowd. Gami moved up with him, passing right through the other students. The tired-looking hero eyed his extra clothing, but chose not to call him out. Instead, he continued on his tangent. "You came here first in the entrance exam, correct?" The gruff man didn't wait for a response. "How far could you throw in middle school?" The teen shuffled a bit at being called out, and grew more nervous as the whispers were coming in from his classmates. He picked at his gloved fingers in an attempt to calm himself down. 46 meters, sir." "Great. Now try it with your quirk. Do whatever you need to, just don't leave the circle." He simply nodded and walked into the circle drawn on the ground. Aizawa tossed him the ball, and he caught it snappily. He could pick out Bakugo's voice yell out loudly over the crowd. "Ha! What's Deku gonna do? He's just a quirkless runt." Ida stepped right in to defend him. "Quirkless? So you haven't heard about his feats during the entrance exam?" The two devolved into squabbles, but Midoriya tried not to listen in. He was stressed enough as it was. Gami ran a hand through his successor's hair, hoping to ease him. The pro seemed to have caught onto the boy's hesitation, so he added a short comment of encouragement. Give it all you've got. He nodded softly at the advice and tossed the ball from hand to hand. He opted to take off his gloves, but decided against it, deeming it not necessary. He quickly glanced to the side to look at his mentor, who stood outside the circle as to not get in his way. Do not worry about Bakugo or the others, the spirit assured. This is your next step. Yeah, the teen mumbled. He shook off his nervousness for now. He didn't want to waste any more of his teacher's time. He had done enough hesitating, so he decided to just jump in head first. He threw the ball directly above him, as high as he could. Threw it, though he could hear the startled gasp from his classmates as they were most likely assuming he would throw it forward. But he didn't have any time to think about them. He was completely focused on launching this ball as far as he could. This was his shot, and he was going to take it. As the ball was in the air, Midoriya flexed his right hand, summoned his scythe. Quickly grabbing it with his other hand, he lifted it behind his head. He only had a single moment before the ball fell back down, but as he poured as much DT as he could into his weapon, he could also hear the breaths of shock at the sight of his massive scythe, but he ignored them as well. He could feel a tiny tingle at the base of his spine, but paid it little attention. The teen watched the ball begin to fall back down to earth. He was hoping to pull the same stunt that he used to take down the zero-pointer, so once the ball got right where he wanted to, he let his weapon come down. I'll prove my worth right here and now. He knew the scythe didn't hit the ball, but that was his plan. He could hear his class yell and cry in surprise as his weapon audibly tore through the air, and just like the swing with the zero-pointer, a loud explosion rang as the shock wave sent the ball flying. It took a few seconds, but eventually the ball came crashing down, a few beeps later, and from Aizawa's direction, so he turned to look and faced the shocked expression of his classmates. It's important for us to know our limits, the teacher started up. He showed the crowd, as well as Midoriya, the monitor that recorded his score on it. The screen had flashed and showed an impressive score of 1,139.6 meters. That's the first rational step towards figuring out what kind of hero you'll be. Aizawa was arguably more shocked than the other kids, but not for the same reasons. He flashed his own quirk right as Midoriya swung his weapon, and was flabbergasted that nothing had happened. He wasn't sure how that was even possible, since his quirk was obviously not a mutation one. He was going to have to pull the kid after the test and take him to Nezu for an explanation. But right now, he kept himself composed and proceeded with his plans. Bakugo would probably give the pro a run for his money, though. He was completely bewildered at what had just happened before his eyes, but his shock quickly turned to rage as his palms started sparking. What the hell? Explain yourself, Deku! The blonde screamed as he charged the shy boy with his explosions, firing off in every direction. Midoriya flinched, and his scythe disappeared from the stress. He raised his gloved hands to shield his face from the incoming attack. He didn't notice that the tips of his gloves started to disintegrate without him meaning to. Gami initially shied away from the amount of light being produced, but he swung into action. He figured he wasn't going to turn solid to stop Bakugo, so he prepared himself to yank his successor out of the way. It was then that the blonde was halted in his tracks, a few strands of cloth wrapping themselves around his body. His explosions also stopped completely, but he didn't seem to realize it. What the? He grimaced. This cloth, it's stiff. It's a capture weapon made of carbon fibers and a special alloy wire, Aizawa corrected. And geez, stop using your quirk already. That was when Bakugo realized his explosions had stopped. He looked back at the teacher but continued to struggle against his binds. I'm getting serious dry eye over here. Midoriya moved a bit away from the raging blonde, but let his excitement take over at seeing his favorite underground hero in action. Wow, you really are a Razorhead. The class began whispering again, and that's when the teen realized he said that out loud. He looked down embarrassingly as the pro released Bakugo from his capture weapon. So you know of me, kid? The teacher questioned. I try to stay out of the media. Well, your quirk is pretty interesting, he mumbled, and I do analysis as a hobby. He didn't say any more on that, so Aizawa proceeded to get the rest of the test going. He could tell this was going to be a long day. The boy returned to the group where he was swamped by Ida, the brunette, and a few other classmates. Whoa, she cried. Now that's a hero-like record if I ever saw one. Indeed, Ida observed, thinking back on the entrance exam. That's a certainly strange but powerful quirk. Midoriya smiled and thanked them for their nice words, but he was eager to be out of the spotlight. Nice swing. You are getting better at that move. He huffed in content at the ghost, but made it seem as if he was panting for breath. The class seemed to realize that the tension from before was gone, and immediately grew excited at the prospect of using their quirks. Comments flew left and right from the rest of the students. "Whoa, this is awesome! 1,100 meters? Seriously? So we can use our quirks for real? Man, the hero course is so great. This is going to be so much fun." Both the teen and his mentor noticed how annoyed their teacher was growing. The Spectre personally knew that the look that the man was giving, and figured he was just about to snap. "Fun, you say?" he stated eerily. Aizawa turned to slowly stare at the group of first-years and loomed over them. He held up his hand to examine it, but neither of the death duo could figure out why. Midoriya believed it was symbolic. Gami believed it was personal. "You're hoping to become heroes after 3 years here," he growled lowly, "and you think it'll be all fun and games." The class shut up at that, but it was too late. Everyone could tell the moon had shifted again, and their teacher was pissed. "All right, then," Aizawa replied sarcastically. "The one with the lowest score across all 8 events will be judged as hopeless." He could hear the cries of protest begin to emerge at his declaration, but it would not change his mind. They had pushed the normally nonchalant pro over the edge. And they'll be expelled. This concludes Chapter 10 of Deku and Death. I'll be back with the next chapter here for you guys soon as well. And as always, thank you so much for listening.